3 days before Christmas dinner, my sister Amanda called and said something that instantly made my entire body go cold. "Don't come to Christmas this year," she said casually. "This dinner isn't for lowly people." Then she hung up before I could answer. I stared at my phone in disbelief, the words echoing in my quiet living room. Lowly. That was the word she chose. Not busy, not inconvenient. Lowly, the timing made it even worse. I had just returned home from an emergency surgery 2 days earlier and could barely move without pain. My doctor had told me to rest for a week. I was lying on my couch in my small Seattle townhouse, a heating pad pressed against my side, when my sister decided to inform me that I wasn't worthy of sitting at her Christmas table. Outside, snow drifted slowly past the windows. Inside, the silence felt heavy. Amanda had always cared deeply about appearances. Her Christmas dinners weren't just family gatherings, they were performances. Business partners, investors, and neighbors filled her dining room every year while she played the role of the perfect hostess. Crystal glasses, catered food, designer decorations, everything polished and elegant. According to her, someone like me didn't fit that image. In her world, I was the embarrassing sister. I worked from home. I wore simple clothes. I drove a 10-year-old sedan instead of a luxury car. I didn't attend charity galas or post glamorous photos online. To Amanda, that meant failure. But the moment she called me lowly, one important detail quietly hung in the air between us. A detail Amanda had apparently forgotten. The private school her children attended. The luxury SUV parked in her driveway. Even the carefully curated lifestyle she proudly displayed on social media every day. All of it was quietly being paid for by me. For the past 2 years, every tuition payment to Oak Ridge Preparatory had come directly from my account. The monthly lease on Amanda's SUV was processed through an automated billing system I had set up. A few smaller household expenses were covered by transfers I scheduled each month so discreetly that no one ever asked where the money came from. Amanda hosted elegant dinners and talked proudly about success, while the financial foundation beneath that success quietly came from the sister she had just called lowly. The truth was that 2 years earlier, her family had been on the edge of financial collapse. Daniel, her husband, worked in property development, and one of his biggest projects had failed when investors suddenly pulled out. Within months, their finances began falling apart. Mortgage payments slipped behind. Credit card balances climbed higher and higher. The first visible crack in their perfect life would have been their children leaving Oak Ridge Preparatory. Amanda panicked when that possibility appeared. One rainy night, she came to my house looking exhausted and frightened. She told me Daniel only needed time to rebuild his reputation and find new investors. If their lifestyle suddenly collapsed, she said, the damage to their image would destroy any chance of recovery. She didn't ask me to fund a luxury life. She said she only needed time. I agreed to help quietly. Instead of handing them money, I simply covered certain expenses so everything would appear stable from the outside. It was supposed to last a few months. 2 years later, those payments were still running automatically. And now, the same sister whose entire image depended on that quiet support had just declared that I was too lowly to attend Christmas dinner. I didn't call her back. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply said one sentence before she hung up. "You're right. Successful people should pay their own bills." Then I picked up my phone and opened my banking app. My name is Natalie Carter. I'm 34 years old and I work as a forensic financial consultant in Seattle. My job is to examine financial records and uncover the truth hidden beneath polished appearances. Corporations hire me to expose fraud, trace money trails, and reveal the reality behind impressive numbers. Ironically, the most elaborate financial illusion I had ever helped maintain wasn't inside a corporation. It was inside my own family. Snow continued falling outside my window as I scrolled down to the section labeled Scheduled Transfers. Tuition payments, vehicle lease payments, monthly household support, each one neatly organized on the screen, quietly sustaining Amanda's carefully constructed life. For 2 years, those payments had run automatically without interruption. I looked at the list for a long moment. Then I realized something very simple. If I was too lowly to sit at her Christmas table, then my money was too lowly to pay for it. One by one, I began canceling everything. After Amanda hung up, the house became so quiet that I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock in my kitchen. For a long moment, I didn't move. I just sat there staring at my phone, replaying her voice in my mind. This party isn't for lowly people. The words felt heavier the second time I heard them in my head. It wasn't just the insult that lingered, it was the confidence behind it. Amanda hadn't sounded angry or emotional when she said it. She sounded certain. Eventually, I unlocked my phone again and opened the banking app. I didn't do it because I planned to change anything yet. I just needed to look at the numbers. The section labeled Scheduled Transfers appeared on the screen, and the list that followed looked strangely ordinary at first glance. It was the same list that had existed there for years, payments that had become part of the background rhythm of my life. But that night, for the first time, I examined every line carefully. At the top was the monthly tuition payment to Oak Ridge Preparatory School, $3,600. The transfer description simply read, Ethan and Lily Tuition. The school had one of the highest academic reputations in the city, but the price reflected that reputation. The next line showed the vehicle lease payment. $1,200 automatically transferred each month to the leasing company that financed Amanda's luxury SUV. Beneath that was a smaller recurring payment labeled Family Support, $650 that went directly to Amanda's household account for groceries and everyday expenses. Altogether, more than $5,000 left my account every month to stabilize my sister's life. I had created those payments 2 years earlier without hesitation. At the time, Amanda had been desperate. Daniel's development project had collapsed almost overnight, and the financial consequences had been brutal. Investors had withdrawn funding. Construction contracts had been canceled. Their income had disappeared while the expenses of maintaining their lifestyle continued. I still remembered the night Amanda asked for help. She had arrived at my house late in the evening, her hair wet from rain and her hands shaking while she spoke. She explained that Daniel needed time to recover professionally. If their lifestyle collapsed publicly, investors would assume his company was finished. Losing the children's place at Oak Ridge Preparatory would be the first visible sign of failure. Amanda was terrified of that moment. I understood the situation well enough to see what she meant. In industries like real estate development, reputation often determined whether opportunities existed at all. People invested in success, not desperation. So I offered to help quietly until Daniel's finances stabilized. But instead of transferring money directly to them, I arranged to pay specific bills myself. Tuition payments went straight to the school. The lease on the SUV was connected to my account through automated billing. Even the smaller household support transfers were structured to keep their basic expenses manageable. For a long time, Amanda treated that help with genuine gratitude. She called me regularly during the first year just to say thank you. She promised more than once that when Daniel's next project succeeded, they would repay everything. I never pressed her about it because I believed the situation would eventually improve. But over time, something subtle began to change. Amanda stopped mentioning the payments entirely. Our conversations shifted toward other topics. When she talked about her life, the financial support I provided slowly disappeared from the story she told. Instead, she began describing their lifestyle as if it had always been the result of Daniel's business success. My phone vibrated suddenly in my hand, interrupting the memory. A new notification appeared at the top of the screen. It was from Instagram. Amanda had posted a story. I opened it without thinking. The video showed her living room glowing with warm Christmas lights. A massive tree decorated with gold ornaments filled the corner of the room. Amanda's voice could be heard in the background laughing while she filmed the space. Guests would arrive soon, she explained to her followers, and this year's dinner was going to be unforgettable. The caption appeared across the top of the screen in elegant lettering. Preparing for an exclusive Christmas gathering, only successful people tonight. I watched the video again, noticing details I had never paid attention to before. The expensive furniture, the marble kitchen counter Daniel had claimed was part of his company's latest success, the polished hardwood floors reflecting the tree lights. Everything in the room suggested stability and wealth. But as I sat alone in my kitchen holding my phone, I understood something Amanda clearly didn't. The life she was presenting to the world depended on a system of financial support she had completely forgotten existed. She believed I was someone who didn't belong in her world anymore. As I looked at the list of scheduled transfers still glowing on my screen, a quiet thought formed in my mind. Amanda wanted a Christmas dinner filled with successful people. For the first time, I began wondering what would happen if she actually had to pay for that success herself. For a long time, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the list of scheduled transfers glowing on my phone. The numbers themselves weren't surprising. I had seen them hundreds of times before when reviewing my monthly finances. What felt different now was the meaning behind them. Each transfer was no longer just a financial decision I had made years ago. Now they looked like something else entirely. They looked like the foundation of a life Amanda believed she had built without me. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, trying to slow my thoughts. The soreness from the surgery still pulsed quietly in my side whenever I shifted position, a reminder that my body needed rest. But my mind refused to slow down. For years, I had convinced myself that helping Amanda was simply part of being family. When our parents died, we had promised each other we would stay close and protect one another no matter what happened. That promise had been the reason I stepped in when her finances began collapsing, but promises only worked when both people honored them. Amanda had clearly moved on from that understanding. Somewhere along the way, the help I offered had stopped being something she appreciated and had instead become something she expected. The quiet transfers leaving my account each month were no longer acts of support in her mind. They were simply part of the invisible structure holding up the life she wanted. My phone vibrated again, pulling me out of my thoughts. A new email notification appeared at the top of the screen. The sender was Oak Ridge Preparatory School. I opened it automatically, assuming it was one of the routine updates they often sent parents and sponsors. The subject line read, "Upcoming Tuition Processing Notice." The message explained that the next semester's tuition payment would be processed automatically in 5 days. I read the sentence twice before setting the phone down on the table. 5 days. That meant the payment would clear exactly 1 day before Amanda's Christmas dinner. I imagined the scene unfolding in her house that night. Amanda greeting her guests with effortless confidence, Daniel explaining his future business plans to investors while expensive wine flowed across the dining table. Conversations about property development, market growth, and success echoing through the room. Everyone there would assume the family hosting the dinner had achieved that success through their own efforts. No one in that room would know the private school education Amanda loved to mention in conversation was funded by the sister she had just described as lowly. My eyes returned to the phone. The banking app was still open, waiting patiently for whatever decision I might make next. I tapped the tuition transfer entry and opened the payment details. The confirmation screen appeared immediately, asking if I wanted to modify or cancel the recurring transfer. For 2 years, that button had never crossed my mind. The payment had always been automatic, unquestioned. But now, the question behind it felt impossible to ignore. If Amanda truly believed I didn't belong in her world anymore, why should my support continue to exist inside it? The thought didn't arrive with anger. It arrived with clarity. Amanda had built her identity around the idea of success. She surrounded herself with people she believed represented status and ambition. If that was the life she wanted, then perhaps it was time for that life to stand on its own. My finger hovered over the cancel option. For a moment, I hesitated, thinking about Ethan and Lily. None of this situation was their fault. They were good kids who had no idea how the finances behind their lives worked. A wave of guilt moved through me, and for a second I almost closed the app without touching anything. Then Amanda's voice echoed again in my mind. "This party isn't for lowly people." The hesitation faded. I pressed the cancel option and confirmed the action. The screen refreshed, and the tuition transfer disappeared from the schedule. A strange calm settled over me as I returned to the list of remaining payments. Next was the $1,200 lease payment for Amanda's SUV. That car had appeared in nearly every photograph she posted online during the last year, a glossy symbol of the lifestyle she worked so hard to display. It took only a few seconds to cancel that payment as well. Finally, I opened the last recurring transfer, the smaller monthly support payment for household expenses. I canceled that one too. When I finished, the list of scheduled transfers looked almost empty. Nearly $5,500 a month had vanished from Amanda's financial safety net with 3 simple confirmations. I set the phone down on the table and exhaled slowly. Amanda had said that successful people paid their own bills. Sitting quietly in my kitchen as snow fell outside the window, I realized she was finally about to find out exactly what that meant. Christmas Eve arrived colder than usual that year. A thin layer of snow covered the sidewalks and rooftops across Amanda's neighborhood, reflecting the glow of thousands of holiday lights. I parked my old sedan halfway down the street from her house and turned off the engine, letting the quiet settle around me. From where I sat, I could see Amanda's home clearly. The front windows were filled with warm golden light, and the enormous Christmas tree inside shimmered with decorations that probably cost more than my entire living room furniture. I hadn't planned to come inside. Technically, I wasn't welcome anymore. Amanda had made that very clear during our phone call 3 days earlier. But despite everything that had happened, I couldn't ignore Ethan and Lily on Christmas Eve. They were children, and none of the tension between their mother and me belonged to them. 2 neatly wrapped boxes rested on the passenger seat beside me. One held a robotics kit Ethan had been talking about for months. The other contained a professional art set Lily had once pointed out during a store visit in the summer. I had ordered both gifts weeks earlier, long before Amanda decided I didn't belong at her dinner table. I stepped out of the car and pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders. The air felt sharp and clean, the kind of winter cold that made every breath visible. As I walked up the driveway, I noticed Amanda's SUV parked beside the garage. The polished black vehicle gleamed beneath the outdoor lights, looking exactly the way Amanda loved to present it in photographs online. For a moment, I paused and studied the car quietly. I knew something Amanda didn't yet realize. 2 days earlier, the automated lease payment connected to that vehicle had failed. The system that had covered the expense for 2 years no longer existed. Somewhere in the leasing company's records, the account was now marked overdue. I continued walking toward the front door. As I approached the house, I could hear faint music drifting from inside. Laughter followed every time the door opened to welcome a new guest. Amanda had clearly succeeded in hosting the kind of gathering she always dreamed about. Through the wide living room windows, I could see people moving around inside holding glasses of wine and champagne. Amanda herself stood near the center of the room greeting guests. She wore an elegant red dress that matched the decorations surrounding the Christmas tree. Daniel stood nearby speaking animatedly with 2 men in dark suits, gesturing toward a set of architectural drawings spread across the dining table. Even from outside, I could tell he was explaining one of his development projects. I climbed the front steps and knocked gently on the door. The music softened as the door opened a few seconds later. Amanda appeared in the doorway, her expression bright and welcoming for the guests she expected to see. The moment she realized it was me, the smile vanished instantly. For a second, neither of us spoke. Amanda's eyes moved quickly from my face to the wrapped gifts in my hands. Then she stepped outside and pulled the door partly closed behind her so the guests inside wouldn't hear the conversation clearly. "What are you doing here?" she asked quietly. Her voice wasn't angry. It was tense, the way people sound when they are worried about being overheard. "I'm not here for dinner," I said calmly, lifting the boxes slightly. "These are for Ethan and Lily. I just came to drop them off." Amanda hesitated, glancing over her shoulder toward the crowded living room. The sounds of conversation and music spilled through the gap in the door behind her. Someone inside laughed loudly, followed by the clink of glasses. "You could have sent them," she said. "Probably," I replied, "but it's Christmas." For a moment, Amanda didn't answer. The cold air moved between us while snowflakes drifted quietly through the porch light. Before she could respond, the front door opened wider behind her. A tall woman wearing a dark green coat stepped onto the porch holding a glass of champagne. "Amanda, is everything all right?" the woman asked. Amanda forced a quick smile and turned slightly so the woman could see me. "It's fine," she said. "Just my sister stopping by for a moment." The woman looked at me with polite curiosity. Then her expression changed slightly, as if something about my face suddenly seemed familiar. "Wait," she said slowly. "Your name wouldn't happen to be Natalie Carter, would it?" The question caught Amanda completely off guard. I nodded, surprised myself. "Yes," I said. "That's right." The woman's face brightened with recognition. "I knew it," she said, turning briefly toward Amanda with visible excitement. "This is the Natalie Carter I mentioned last month, the financial investigator whose report uncovered that major investment fraud case in Chicago." For the first time since I arrived, Amanda looked genuinely confused. Inside the house, several nearby guests had begun watching the conversation at the door with growing interest. The woman stepped fully onto the porch and held out her hand with an enthusiastic smile. "Veronica Hayes," she said. "I work in corporate marketing for several investment groups in Seattle. I've read 2 of your financial investigation reports. They circulate more than you probably realize." I shook her hand, still slightly surprised by the recognition. "Nice to meet you." Behind her, Amanda's expression had tightened into something carefully controlled. She clearly hadn't expected the situation to turn in this direction. For a moment, she looked like someone who had suddenly lost the script to a conversation she thought she understood. "Oh," Amanda said quickly, forcing a light laugh. "Natalie does some consulting work from home. She's just dropping off gifts for the kids." Veronica tilted her head slightly, studying me with open curiosity. "Consulting work?" she said. "That's one way to describe it. The Carter analysis report on the Midwest real estate fraud investigation was impressive. Half the finance department in my company discussed it for weeks." Amanda blinked, clearly trying to process the information. Behind Veronica, several guests standing near the entrance had begun drifting closer. It wasn't unusual at gatherings like this for conversations to shift toward interesting professional topics, and Veronica's tone had immediately caught their attention. Before Amanda could redirect the moment, Daniel appeared in the hallway carrying a glass of wine. He had likely noticed the cluster of guests forming near the door. When he saw me standing on the porch, his smile flickered briefly before returning with practiced confidence. "Natalie," he said warmly, "I didn't realize you were stopping by tonight." "I'm not staying," I replied calmly, lifting the wrapped boxes again. "Just bringing these for Ethan and Lily." Daniel nodded politely, but Veronica spoke again before the moment could move on. "Daniel, did you know your sister-in-law is Natalie Carter?" she asked. Daniel glanced at Amanda quickly before answering. "Of course," he said. "Natalie works with financial analysis." "Financial analysis?" Veronica laughed lightly. "That's like saying a surgeon works with small knives. She's one of the best forensic financial investigators in the country." The words carried clearly into the living room. Several guests exchanged curious looks. One of the men who had been speaking with Daniel earlier stepped closer, clearly intrigued. "You're the investigator who uncovered the Horizon Development accounting fraud last year?" he asked. I nodded. "Part of a larger team, yes." The man's eyebrows lifted in recognition. "That case forced 3 executives to resign and triggered federal investigations. That was major news in our industry." Daniel's confident posture began to shift slightly. The conversation was clearly moving into territory he hadn't anticipated. Amanda quickly stepped forward, attempting to regain control of the situation. "Natalie has been recovering from surgery," she said. "She shouldn't be standing outside in the cold. She was just leaving." Veronica didn't move. "In that case, she should come inside for a moment," she replied casually. "I'd love to ask her about how those financial tracing models work." More guests were now watching openly. The atmosphere inside the house had shifted from casual holiday celebration to something more curious. Conversations paused as people tried to follow what was happening near the entrance. Daniel forced another smile and gestured toward the living room. "Of course," he said. "Come in for a moment." Amanda shot him a quick look of alarm, but by then it was too late. Veronica had already stepped aside to allow me to enter. I walked inside slowly, brushing snow from my coat as the warmth of the house surrounded me. The Christmas tree lights reflected across the polished floor, while soft music played somewhere in the background. Several guests stood nearby watching with interest. One of the men Daniel had been speaking with earlier approached me. "I run investment analysis for a property group downtown," he said. "We followed that Horizon investigation closely. Your firm exposed a lot of hidden liabilities in that case." I nodded politely. "Forensic accounting tends to reveal things that financial presentations sometimes overlook." The man chuckled. "That's a diplomatic way of saying people lie about money." A few nearby guests laughed quietly. Daniel shifted beside the dining table, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Veronica raised her glass slightly and looked around the room. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "it's funny how reputation works. Some people build their image around appearances. Others build theirs around uncovering the truth behind those appearances." The room grew slightly quieter. Amanda stood near the kitchen doorway now, watching the conversation with tense shoulders. No one mentioned the words she had used about me earlier in the week, but the contrast between the story she had told about her lowly sister and the person now standing in her living room had become impossible to ignore. For a moment, the room held a strange kind of attention, the quiet curiosity that appears when people suddenly realize they are hearing something unexpected. Conversations around the dining table slowed, and a few guests stepped closer as Veronica continued speaking about the investigation reports my firm had published. Daniel still stood beside the architectural drawings on the table, holding his glass of wine a little too tightly while watching the direction the discussion had taken. "So what exactly does a forensic financial investigator do day to day?" one of the guests asked. The man who spoke introduced himself as Mark, a partner in a regional investment firm that funded commercial construction projects. His tone was casual, but his interest was genuine. "Most of the time we analyze financial records for companies or investors," I explained. "We review accounting statements, transaction histories, and corporate structures to identify risks that might not be visible on the surface." "Meaning hidden debt?" Mark asked. "Sometimes debt," I replied. "Sometimes inconsistent reporting. Sometimes business models that look profitable publicly but collapse once the underlying numbers are examined." Several people nodded thoughtfully. Conversations about money often carried a quiet intensity at gatherings like this, especially when investors were present. Daniel stepped forward then, attempting to steer the discussion in a safer direction. "Natalie's work is very technical," he said smoothly. "Real estate development operates a little differently. Investors understand the risks involved." Veronica smiled slightly but didn't argue. "Of course," she said, "but it's always useful to have someone in the room who knows how to spot financial inconsistencies." Amanda shifted uncomfortably near the kitchen counter. She had been quiet since I entered the house, watching the conversation unfold with increasing tension. Another guest raised a question from across the living room. "Have you ever uncovered something unexpected during an investigation? Something that looked completely legitimate at first?" I considered the question for a moment. "Almost every investigation starts that way," I said. "Most financial structures appear stable until someone examines the numbers closely. Reputation and presentation can create a very convincing story." Mark laughed softly. "That sounds like half the deals in the property development world." A few people chuckled. Daniel attempted to laugh as well, but the sound lacked the easy confidence he had shown earlier in the evening. "Well, development projects are always complicated," he said. "You have to manage perception carefully while the long-term results take shape." "True," I agreed calmly, "but eventually financial reality always catches up with perception." The words hung in the air for a moment longer than anyone expected. Amanda glanced quickly toward the front window, her eyes briefly landing on the driveway outside. The black SUV still sat beneath the porch light, its polished surface reflecting the falling snow. Before anyone could continue the conversation, a sharp knock sounded against the front door. The sudden noise cut through the music and the quiet discussions instantly. Everyone in the room turned toward the entrance. Daniel frowned slightly and walked across the living room toward the door. Through the frosted glass panel beside it, a dark silhouette stood on the porch. Behind the figure, bright amber lights flashed across the snow-covered driveway. Daniel opened the door. A man wearing a heavy winter jacket stood outside holding a clipboard. Behind him, a tow truck idled at the curb, its engine rumbling quietly in the cold night air. "Good evening," the man said professionally. "I'm looking for the owner of the black SUV parked in the driveway." Daniel looked confused. "Why?" The man glanced at the paperwork on his clipboard. "I'm here regarding the lease account associated with that vehicle. The payment authorization connected to the account has been canceled, and the most recent payment was not received. According to company policy, the vehicle is now scheduled for repossession." The words carried clearly into the living room behind Daniel. For several seconds, no one spoke. Amanda's face turned pale as she stepped closer to the doorway. "There must be some mistake," she said quickly. The representative shook his head politely. "The automated payment system was terminated 2 days ago. The account now shows an unpaid balance. Unless the payment can be resolved tonight, we're required to recover the vehicle." Guests standing near the entrance exchanged uncertain glances. The elegant Christmas dinner Amanda had spent weeks preparing had suddenly become something very different. And standing quietly near the Christmas tree, I realized that Amanda was finally discovering what it felt like when financial reality interrupted a carefully crafted image. For several seconds after the leasing representative finished speaking, no one in the room moved. The only sound came from the faint rumble of the tow truck engine outside and the soft holiday music still playing in the background. Amanda stood near the doorway, staring at the man with the clipboard as if the words hadn't fully reached her yet. Daniel reacted first. He stepped forward quickly, lowering his voice as he moved onto the porch. "There must be a mistake," he said firmly. "That vehicle has an automatic payment arrangement." The representative glanced calmly at the paperwork in his hand. "It did," he replied, "but the billing authorization connected to the account was canceled 2 days ago. The payment for this month wasn't received." Inside the house, the guests were now openly watching the conversation unfold at the entrance. No one was pretending not to notice anymore. Amanda stepped beside Daniel, her voice tight. "Canceled? By who?" "I don't have that information," the man answered. "Our system only shows that the authorization was terminated. Without an active payment method, the account is considered delinquent." Daniel rubbed his forehead and turned slightly away from the doorway, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. "If the balance is paid now, will the account remain active?" he asked. "Yes," the representative said. "If the outstanding payment is processed tonight, we can close the recovery order." Daniel glanced toward Amanda. For the first time that evening, the confident expression she had worn throughout the party completely disappeared. Her eyes moved quickly from Daniel to the guests inside the living room and then back to the man standing on the porch. "How much is the payment?" she asked quietly. $1,200, the representative replied. The number wasn't large compared to the expensive lifestyle Amanda had spent the evening presenting to her guests. But the silence that followed the answer revealed something important. Amanda didn't immediately pull out her phone. Daniel didn't reach for a wallet or step aside to make a quick call. Instead, they both hesitated, standing awkwardly in the doorway while several pairs of curious eyes watched from inside the house. Mark, the investor who had spoken with me earlier, shifted uncomfortably near the dining table. He clearly hadn't expected the evening to move in this direction. Daniel finally cleared his throat. "We'll resolve this," he said, forcing a tight smile toward the guests. "Just a small billing mix-up." The representative remained patient but unmoved. "I understand," he said, "but if the payment isn't processed soon, I'll have to proceed with the repossession order." Amanda turned toward Daniel again, whispering something urgently. The tension between them was visible even from across the room. A few guests began quietly retrieving their coats from the hallway. Elegant holiday dinners rarely continued smoothly after financial disputes appeared at the front door. Veronica watched the situation with calm attention, her expression thoughtful rather than amused. When Daniel finally stepped back into the house, she spoke quietly but clearly. "Daniel," she said, "the investors I represent value transparency when we evaluate potential development partners. Situations like this tend to raise questions." Daniel stiffened slightly. "I'm sure it's nothing serious," Veronica continued politely, "but financial consistency is important in our industry." The meaning behind her words didn't need further explanation. Within minutes, the atmosphere of celebration had dissolved completely. Conversations ended. Guests began offering polite excuses about early morning commitments or other holiday plans. One by one, they stepped out into the cold night, passing the tow truck still waiting beside the driveway. Amanda stood motionless in the center of the living room as the house slowly emptied around her. The enormous Christmas tree still glowed beautifully in the corner, but the room now felt strangely hollow. I picked up my coat from the chair near the entrance. No one stopped me. Amanda looked toward me briefly, her eyes filled with a mixture of shock and confusion. The The confidence she had displayed earlier that evening had completely vanished. Outside, the cold air felt sharp against my face as I walked down the driveway toward my car. Behind me, the tow truck's engine grew louder as the operator prepared to load the black SUV Amanda had proudly displayed to the world. For the first time in a long while, the image Amanda had built so carefully was no longer holding itself together. And the silence that followed felt very different from the tension that had existed before. I drove home that night through quiet streets covered in fresh snow, the city lights reflecting softly across the windshield of my old sedan. The entire evening replayed in my mind while the heater hummed quietly inside the car. It hadn't felt like revenge the way dramatic stories often describe it. No shouting, no confrontation, just a moment when reality quietly replaced illusion. For years, I had believed helping Amanda was the right thing to do. When Daniel's development project collapsed 2 years earlier, their finances had unraveled quickly. Amanda had been terrified that their children would have to leave Oak Ridge Preparatory, the private school she believed protected their social reputation. I had stepped in without hesitation, arranging tuition payments, covering the lease for her SUV, and quietly transferring money each month so their household could stay afloat while Daniel rebuilt his business. At the time, I told myself it was temporary. Families helped each other through difficult periods. That was how loyalty worked. But somewhere along the way, Amanda stopped seeing it that way. The support became invisible to her. Instead of gratitude, she began telling a different story about her life, one where everything she owned represented her own success. When she called me lowly 3 days before Christmas, she wasn't just insulting me. She was revealing how completely she had rewritten the truth. The weeks after Christmas were surprisingly quiet. Amanda didn't call. Daniel didn't try to explain what had happened that night. For the first time in years, the monthly financial pressure that had quietly followed me through my life simply disappeared. Without those recurring transfers leaving my account, my finances felt calmer, but more importantly, my mind felt clearer. I realized something I had ignored for a long time. Supporting family is generous when it comes from mutual respect. But when one person begins using that support to maintain an illusion of superiority, the relationship stops being healthy for either side. Several months later, I heard small updates through distant relatives. Ethan and Lily had transferred to a well-respected public school closer to their neighborhood. Daniel had taken a more stable management position within a regional development firm rather than continuing to chase large speculative projects. The extravagant dinner parties and social events Amanda once hosted disappeared quietly from her social media. At first, I worried about the children more than anything else. They had grown up surrounded by an expensive lifestyle Amanda worked hard to maintain. But one afternoon in early spring, I attended Ethan's weekend soccer game at his new school. He ran across the muddy field laughing with his teammates, completely unconcerned about where the school uniforms came from or what kind of car his parents drove. After the game, Lily showed me a sketchbook full of drawings she had been working on in her art class. Watching her flip through the pages with excitement reminded me of something simple but important. Children care far more about stability and encouragement than they do about appearances. Amanda and I eventually spoke again months later. The conversation was careful and short, the kind people have when they both understand that something fundamental has changed between them. She didn't apologize directly, and I didn't demand one. Some lessons arrive quietly through consequences rather than arguments. Looking back now, that Christmas dinner was never really about an invitation. It was about boundaries. Amanda believed success meant impressing the people around her. I believed success meant living honestly within the reality you create. When those two ideas collided, the truth simply revealed itself. And maybe that's the real lesson behind this story. Sometimes the strongest response to disrespect isn't anger or confrontation. Sometimes it's simply stepping back and allowing people to carry the weight of the life they've chosen. If you've ever faced a moment where you had to choose between protecting family and protecting your own boundaries, I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Stories like this resonate because many people have lived through something similar. Feel free to share your perspective in the comments. And if you enjoy real-life family drama stories where truth, karma, and quiet justice eventually turn the tables, stay with this channel and consider subscribing so you don't miss the next story. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.